So right now I'm in the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action. At anyone claim at home, the last time water was not in the Victorian Department name was the start of the Millennium Drought. The fact it was 26 degrees in Melbourne yesterday sends all scary signals to those of us who work in water management. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land we are meeting on today, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It was wonderful to have a welcome from Uncle Bill, and it continues to amaze me. The more I learn, the more of those smoking ceremonies I attend. So for those of you who that might have been your first experience, I hope it leaves a lasting memory for you. But I've been part of many of those ceremonies, and the thing I reflect on is everyone has an impact, and I learn every time I hear a new bit of a story that I haven't heard before. And Uncle Bill spoke about it. One of the challenges is that as part of my education, we didn't hear the Victorian Aboriginal creation stories, but I have now had the privilege to be working in that space and continue to hear how Melbourne's formed, and it is amazing the number of aha moments you have when you hear that history coming from our elders. On behalf of the Victorian Government, I wanted to welcome you all to Victoria, to Melbourne, or Naarm, as Uncle Bill let us know. We are thrilled to have the Australian Water Partnership here and the representatives who have joined us from many a place close and quite distant. In way of context, as I said, I am Deb Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Water Sector Strategy and Partnerships in DECA. I'm guessing none of you know what that means. In short, my day job is to oversee all water sector agencies in Victoria from their governance, compliance and performance. But I also have the privilege of overseeing Victoria's Aboriginal water program, so the work we are doing to transfer knowledge and power to our First Nations people. In welcoming you all here, I do just particularly want to acknowledge a number of special and key people in the room. Mr. Baron Waka, Secretary-General of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and Bigobu Lucia Lefort Lau, CEO of the Pacific Water and Wastewater Association. I do hope the next days you hear and learn from us, but we also hear and learn from your experiences. In addition to my role as Victorian Public Servant and in welcoming you on behalf of the Victorian Government, I also have the privilege of being Victoria's State Representative on the E-Water Board, and thus probably my stronger introduction to the role of the AWP. So previously, my knowledge of E-Water was particularly attached to the work they do around the source model or the modelling platform for water resource management, and been pretty active in using the outputs of that work in water resource management activities I've done. But having joined the board, one of the real privileges has been to see the work and hear about the work of the Australian Water Partnership under the leadership of Sarah and others within E-Water. And the other time is those very random conversations I've had with current and past colleagues that have been drawn upon to attend and support the AWP in the work that they do. The AWP has been working for 10 years to support the sustainable management across the region, and is a real asset to Australia, that we can support our regional partners in a very practical way. But as I said, also ensure that those experiences are brought back and reflected on in the way that we undertake water management in Australia. There's been connections also between the AWP and the state government over the years, where a lot of, proud to say, the expertise does lie in terms of how the Australian system works and operates, and how we can value and share those experiences with our partners across the Pacific. DECA has engaged pretty actively in the delivery of training on cultural climate resilient water management, and we'll hear a bit of that today. And individual water utilities or water corporations are really proud to be part of the work in providing services or experience out into the regions. And I do know, for example, the Colibri Water Vietnam experience, just how impactful examples such as those have been on both the organisation, but also those individuals that have been part of that program. So I really just want to emphasise it is a partnership. So AWP a partnership, but we do truly see it as that two-way relationship. and can acknowledge that we now have 250 Australian partners, and many of those are working internationally and within Australia, including Victoria, and many of you are part of those 250, and so amazing to see so many making the time to join us today. Uncle Bill spoke about it. We need to tell the truth, we need to share information, and we need to be united in the work that we do. And I would say that the importance of truth telling is that we don't only share the wins or the things that we do well, but also reflect on the challenges or the mistakes we've made. And we do know, particularly in our relationship with our First Nations people, we've made mistakes, and our job is to acknowledge, to talk about it, but to do things differently. And I think that is what is central to the great work that the AWP does, is sharing the good, the bad, and the things that can be done better. So I really hope those water connections grow. Australia has a lot to contribute to this region and to the world, especially in those climate sensitive ways. Our experience around trying to transition to net zero, the activities we've done in relation to climate adaptation and how it impacts on the water cycle, and also managing water under a scarce and changing climate. That's all a lot of words, and I think the most important thing you'll get from the next couple of days is practical and lived experiences. So I'm really pleased to now hand over to my colleague, Rob Considine, who will speak about how Victoria has undertaken urgent climate action across the water cycle, and specifically within the water sector, and our path to net zero. So for those of you who don't live and breathe this, for Victoria, the water sector has committed to 100% renewable energy for our production this year and a move to net zero by 2035. It's a pretty ambitious pathway. It's not without bumps and challenges, and I really thank Rob for his time today to share his experience in leading this program. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Deb, and I'd like to join with you in acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, and how good was it this morning to be on the banks of the Birra and see Uncle Bill welcome us to their country. Also, thank you, Deb, for opening this event. I'd like to join you as well in welcoming everyone, if you're not from Victoria, to Victoria, as we talk to you about urgent climate action across the water cycle. So today what I'm hoping to cover is how Victoria is taking climate action more broadly, our legislative framework, the science, including the climate science report that was published in December, the second one in Victoria. We're doing those every 5 years under legislation, and the natural hazards that presents to Victoria's communities. I'll talk about the water path to net zero, some of the context and institutions that we use to provide water services in Victoria, the policy development that occurred almost 10 years ago that led to statutory targets and the progress that we're making towards those. I'll also talk about towards a climate resilient future in water, some of the impacts that we're seeing, how we're putting research into practice, and for flooding, building that connection between land use, development, and natural hazards made worse by climate change. So if we just move on to the next one, Victoria's Climate Action Framework. So the Victorian economy as a whole, the entire state, has a statutory target of net zero emissions by 2045 and climate resilient communities. You can see our targets there that are set out for this year, a 28 to 33% reduction in emissions across a range of sectors. That's supported by our Victorian Climate Science Report, published in December by the department last year, which is the best available climate change science and data to guide adaptation action. Water is one of 7 systems under legislation that produces an adaptation action plan that we produce in the department to guide adaptation actions across the water cycle. And that's supported by leading climate action through Victorian government operations. The water sector is an ambitious leader. So if we look at the key findings from the Climate Science Report, it delivers some very telling messages to all Victorians. Our climate has continued to warm since the 19th century, becoming drier in recent decades, experiencing more frequent and intense climate hazards. That will continue as we experience warmer future climate with increased average temperatures and more frequent and intense hot days and heat waves. We're likely to become drier, especially in winter throughout the cool season, April to October, which is when traditionally we would fill our storages. That's much less likely in the future. And of course, we've seen in Victoria devastating floods in October and November 2022, had huge impact over almost all of Victoria, still disrupts people in their lives today. Not everyone is back in their homes yet. So if we just have a look at the climate hazards in Victoria, I won't go into these in too much detail. They include heat waves and the significant increases in the intensity, frequency and duration of concurrent droughts and heat waves. Bushfires, including more likely and severe bushfires right across Victoria and a lengthening of the fire season. Right now in Victoria, we have multiple councils giving fire restrictions, which is really unusual for this time of year in Victoria. With drought, showing droughts are much more likely to develop more quickly, with a tertiary atmosphere leading to faster onset of drought. Currently, we have restrictions in Victorian towns, including Apollo Bay, which has already increased its level of restrictions since going into them in early April. With floods, if greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise at a moderate to higher rate, flood risks will double by the end of this century. I'll just say that one again because that's actually pretty significant. Flood risks will double by the end of this century. In terms of sea level rise, if emissions continue to rise, we continue to see increasing sea levels as we are seeing now at Williamstown, for example, in the Bay. And of course, we see concurrent events. I was in Bairnsdale last week. That was where, in 2023, we had the water treatment plant under a flood warning from the Mitchell River, followed by a bushfire first, and then flood. So it went within a week. So the water treatment plant operators weren't able to access the water treatment plant due to the fire and the exclusion zone around the fire, and then they weren't able to access it due to the flood that followed. So concurrent emergencies in Victoria. So what are we doing about it? The Rural Path to Net Zero, which are regulated targets to deliver innovative and efficient emissions reductions in the Victorian water sector. So firstly, a little context on the Victorian water sector. If you're not familiar, we have 18 state-owned water corporations. The Minister for Water appoints the boards to those water corporations. They are independent skill-based boards, autonomous water corporations under the Water Act. And the Minister can issue statements of obligations which set out statutory requirements in the operations of those water boards. Pricing is done at arm's length of government in Victoria through our Independent Essential Services Commission. There's a couple of reasons why the water sector in Victoria needs to be an ambitious climate leader. First of all, it was severely affected by the millennium drought, which had a devastating impact on communities right around Victoria, but also contribute 25% of emissions for the Victorian government. So it's a really significant set of emissions. At the moment, as you'll see on some graphs, due to a combination of the energy they source and also the emissions from wastewater treatment plants. As they mentioned, will be 100% renewable energy this year. But they also have a unique emissions profile with opportunities in biogas, solar, hydrogen, recycled water, biochar, waste to energy, but some challenges with very hard to abate emissions from wastewater treatment. So our journey began almost 10 years ago with establishing the commitment in Water for Victoria, the state's policy for water, which committed to net zero emissions in the water sector. That was backed up in 2018 to 2022 through regulated targets across the sector, setting out to achieve a 42.4% reduction in emissions by 2025, almost 94% by 2030, which is in reach now, and net zero by 2035. And of course, our commitment to be 100% renewable this year. In terms of actual progress, you can see here, emissions have peaked in the water sector. Over this period, from 2011 to 2025, say, you add about 1 million people to Victoria's population at the moment per decade. So you can see there's been significant population growth in that time, but nonetheless emissions reduction have come down, peaking in around the year 1920 and now below where we started during the aggregated baseline from 2011 to 2016. Later this year, we hope to see that come down even further as we shift to 100% renewable. And then by 2030, you can see the dramatic reductions to 94%. How is that happening? It's happening through on-ground partnership and economies of scale. Zero emissions water is one great example in northern Victoria, which enables joint investment across 12 water corporations in large-scale solar. The photo there includes the Minister for Water and the Minister for Energy. Bowen Water, which is in Geelong, has already achieved their 100% renewable electricity target. Those investments are reducing energy costs and customer bills while generating revenue from surplus electricity. But wastewater emissions remain a big challenge. You can see there that some of the products that come out of wastewater, methane and nitrous oxide, are very significantly more potent than carbon dioxide emissions. There are current solutions that are available, but they are expensive and not yet at scale. So therefore, in order to achieve our net zero targets, the sector is heavily reliant on carbon offsets after the shift to renewable energy. But on the upside of the downside, most of the emissions, 75%, come from two single sources. So through targeted investment, we hope to get there and reduce our dependency on offsets all the time. In terms of adaptation and moving towards a climate resilient future in water, our Water Cycle Climate Change Adaptation Action Plan, which is to be renewed next year, sets out the impacts of climate change across the water cycle. So if we just shift to the next one there. And I've already talked about some of these impacts. I won't labour the point now. We have a significant program, the Victorian Water and Climate Initiative, which invests in hydrology and climate research. There's an example there from the River at Eversley, which is an extreme case, but it can show you the drop in flows. That's sort of on the top right of the graphic there. Also, spatially resolved impacts of climate change shown for the Victoria across the bottom there, so that local planning can adapt to climate change as it impacts locally. An example of applying the latest science to regional scale planning is shown here. So you have to look pretty closely now. So looking at the graph on the right, which has got total system storage for the Melbourne system on the vertical axis, and dates across the graph going from 2024 through to 2026. The black line is where we're trending now. So it's been the driest summer in 12 years. Is that right? Yeah, Deb's got 12 years. So Victoria, and this has been repeated right across the state. And so what we're using here is what could happen, different graphs there being shown around what would happen in a wet year, a long-term average, and different scenarios versus what will happen, so that decisions can be made around how we adapt to climate change. In Melbourne, that's particularly true the likely order from our desalination plant, which can supply around a third of Melbourne's. And the sort of final point I wanted to make before I sum up is how we're building flood resilience in Victoria. One of the key things we're doing is to better communicate and manage flood hazard risk. That's through providing best available information about flooding through VicPaint, which is the state's mapping tool, so that communities can access the latest flood information. We're including new modelling information through streamlining planning scheme amendments to control development use, so we don't continue to build homes in floodplains. And new guidelines for the design of flood resilient buildings. As the floodplains grow with extreme events, there will be a need to adapt homes in Victoria to flooding. We're also undertaking highest priority flood mitigation actions through our 10 regional floodplain strategies across Victoria, prioritised flood studies and repeated investment from the Victorian Government in flood studies over the last few years, including 26.7 million in the building flood resilience in Victoria this year. So just to wrap up, Victoria is taking climate action through our legislative framework in the Climate Action Act, including statewide stage targets for net zero emissions. We published the climate science report across those natural hazards I spoke about, those 5 natural hazards every 5 years, and mapping those across the slab. Our water sector is on the path to net zero through its shift to 100% renewable energy, operationalised targets, the sector-wide targets of 94% reductions by 2030, and an ultimate aim of net zero by 2035. Each water corporation has its own targets. They're not the same to reflect the starting point and the capacity of those communities to adjust to this. And the water cycle is adapting to a climate resilient future in water because there's an understanding of how climate change impacts across the water cycle, the investment of research in hydrology in particular, and how it's embedded into practice as a shaping of the Melbourne system. And there are strong links to mitigation of crop impacts through the planning systems, particularly water. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. We're very fortunate to have you hanging around a little bit for some questions too. And I'd like to welcome Deb back up, who will join us for some questions. So if there are any questions for Rob and Deb after that very informative presentation, Rob, thank you. Just pop your hand up because I've got a mic and Omar has a mic. He'll be racing around with it.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Rob. John Riddle in Victoria. Deb, the department introduced a pretty progressive plan called the Aboriginal Water Plan to look at management options and components for managing environmental water and sections of waterway. How's that implementation going?
Thanks, Ian. So in 2022, the state government released a document called Water is Life, and that talks about the commitments to transfer resources and decision-making back to our First Nations people. But if you have not seen it, one of the unique features of that document is the back half of it are nation statements, which are statements from 14 of our First Nations group that speak about their aspirations for water without amendments. So that is only one of 3 documents in Victorian policy that have unedited statements from our First Nations people alongside government policy, and those 3 documents are all in the water space. So to Ian's question, for those of you who don't know, part of Victoria's entitlement framework or water management framework is also the creation of environmental entitlements, which are water set aside for the use and restoration of environmental values. So we've had that in place since about 2005. The legislation went through with the environmental water holder. 2009 legislation, can't quite remember. But what we've done ever since is that our catchment management authorities can put to government or the Victorian environmental water holder a plan that says this wetland or this breach of a river or this floodplain needs water this year for this purpose. And that's always been based on environmental values. What we've been seeing in the Victorian context is that cultural values and the cultural watering of sites, and Uncle Bill spoke about one particular site of significance, which is the Bolin wetland, where the watering of that site from history or a cultural perspective may not be the same as the environmental views or opinions. And what we've been starting to enable is that First Nations groups have been able to put forward proposals for access to that environmental watering to see it being used at site or on country from a cultural point of view. We have 5 trials up in the northern part of Victoria where that proposal, without going through the CMA, is currently being considered by the Victorian Environmental Water Holder. We've got examples of watering right across the state where we've seen cultural watering occurred, and for some communities and some First Nations groups, such as the Wadawurrung at the top of the Moorabool, it's the first time they've seen water in country in their generation, and the instantaneous change in that landscape has been amazing. So the Moorabool watering at Lake Bostock Reservoir, it had not seen water for the generations, and they put water in it last year as a trade-off as part of some of the work we've been doing here around Melbourne water supply. They saw eels within a week. They heard birds and frogs and noises they've never heard before as generations. So some of those elders that Bill spoke about who continue to try and influence change for the first time of seeing a country watered due to some pretty simple and easy decisions. And what I'd say is that plan really speaks to pilots and opportunities. The biggest challenge we probably have in Victoria is the legislation around water use is very prescriptive around who does what it's for and for what purpose. So while we've been able to do a lot within that framework, one of our changes is how we consider probably a more enabling, more contemporary legislation. And anyone who's worked in government will know changing legislation, particularly around water, is not a easy activity. But on the whole, some really great outcomes within a reasonably constrained legislative framework.
I'm Catherine Cross, like Water Sensitive Cities Australia at Monash University. I had two questions. The first was around the targets. I think you started to answer that, but how were the targets negotiated, and what was the pushback, and how was it overcome? And sorry, the second question, just related to what you were talking about, was I'm just wondering whether the climate action framework links to biodiversity targets.
Yep. Off I go. So there's a natural environment adaptation action plan, as well as the water cycle adaptation action plan. So they're sort of separate, but for example, we've recently committed an additional $2 million to the National National Authorities to progress water cycle adaptation action. And what we've asked them to do is to prioritise the natural environment adaptation actions if they can do both at the same time. So that's an example of how we do that. In terms of the target setting back between 2018 and 2022, the water corporations, for net zero and our path to net zero, there was a positive obligation in that process to do it efficiently. But the water sector was very motivated because of the millennium drought and the need to take change by themselves. So it wasn't so much cajoling from the department with the reluctant sector. It was more about setting practical targets that could be affordable and that could generate additional value. So those targets have led to really significant innovation across the water sector. An example is the Wodonga water treatment plant operated by Northeast Water. It's led to a complete re-engineering of that water treatment plant, which actually generates revenue from the sale of new products, including a biogas to some dedicated industries, and also through partnership with Commonwealth, the opportunity for hydrogen generation in the longer term as well. So by setting clearer targets that are time-bound, day to time, and that can be practically achieved and meet the investment cycles that water corporations working, 5-year cycles. That's why every water corporation has their own target. They have a different starting point, a different ending point that has been resolved through consultations with their communities through the pricing process as well.
Following on from a similar perspective, my name is Carleen Madden. I'm the South Australian Water Ambassador. Great presentations. Thank you to you both. Victoria's doing some amazing work. My question is around the adoption of innovation in the water space and how challenging it is, his procurement process in the government and albeit government monopolies. How do you actually create the environment where innovation can be at the forefront of what you're doing? You've got significant money already invested in existing assets and changing to what the future needs to change to. It could be really gifted in that environment. I'm wondering how Victoria is approaching it.
This is the Rob Deb tag team effort. Who wants to take the question? I think there's probably a couple of things. Rob spoke about it. For those of you who are familiar with the Victorian water sector, they aim high. So I think the aspiration around innovation is that they're pretty self-motivated to innovate. And then one of our challenges is ensuring they have the right enabling environment to do that. So we're really lucky for the Water Corporation and the partnerships they have, both into academia, into our consultants, and into some of the think tanks about what is possible. We spoke about the fact that those statement of obligations for emission reductions are embedded in a statement of obligation. So what I guess that does is give a little bit of coverage from government that says if that's where you're going, go there, and part of that you'll need to do innovation. So we have arrangements in Victoria where, while they're state-owned entities, water corporations can undertake things like non-regulated revenue activities or commercial ventures that are approved by the minister. So while a lot of the innovations, like the example Rob spoke about at North East, they're looking at innovation to improve or be more efficient or innovative in the way they do wastewater services. If they wanted to take that one step further into revenue raising through biochar or gas sales, what they do is they seek permission from the government to do a non-water service activity, and it's really a risk-based approach. So I guess for us, it's a little bit of sector competitive. They're pretty competitive as a group of 18, so they will want to do better. We also have a program called the Intelligent Water Networks, where those 18 entities share their innovation and experience. So if someone's done a bit of a run on an idea like biochar and some of the innovations in treatments, they actually share that with the other entities. We ensure that we have a framework where they can price for those transitions, and we have a framework that permits them to within reason, do commercial activities that push beyond, I guess, their water and wastewater service obligations.
I was just going to add, in terms of upcoming and emerging professionals within the water sector, the Minister for Water does have an innovation challenge annually. And so, for example, the most recent round, they were targeting the one that got up with one. There were two. The one at Southeast Water was a floating generator of hydrogen gas that didn't require an energy input. It was based on the Australian science winner, which was really interesting to see how that trial will go. And the second one was about the embedded energy in concrete and reducing the amount of energy needed to produce concrete, because the water sector uses a lot of concrete. So these are typically people who've been in the water sector for 5 or so years. They're trying to make a career for themselves. They put up these ideas. There's generally about less than $100,000 per winner to progress their idea. But it's sort of that innovation at that level is also covered, as well as the institutions.
So Rob, I just wanted to close that out because there's an example that I want people to go and find. So there is a little bit of government investment. So in Victoria, we are lucky that we have what's known as the environmental contribution, which is a portion of everyone's water bill is set aside to go back and invest in offsetting the impact of water use in Victoria. So that's known as the environmental contribution. And so we do have the opportunity to do seed funding like the climate initiative from the minister. And the other example that, just because I love it, is that one of the previous examples is the creation of floating wetlands on water treatment, where we use natural processes to actually intervene in the processes. And why I raised it is that we've also been using that in waterways, and there is a number of floating wetlands on the bottom of the Birrarung, which we've invested in from a state government point of view to see if we can do different types of water treatment, particularly where you've got very little opportunity far down the catchment. But also from a biodiversity point of view, we've seen amazing biodiversity changes in those wetlands. So if you are walking around locally, there are a couple of those floating wetlands not very far from here. So they're often cygnets and swans and water rats, if you're lucky enough to see them, as well as ducks and other vegetation.
Thank you. Yep, thank you both for your insights and inspirations. It's great to sort of hear the government creating an enabling environment, and then water sector organisations bringing innovative ideas. Sitting in the middle of all of that are the technical regulators, your environmental regulator, health and economic regulator. And so picking up on Carlene's sort of comments, have you got some tips for us in making sure that they are active participants in fostering that innovation while still discharging the statutory duties, but also being an active player in driving action on the ground through better coordination, but also maybe slightly different approaches to this issue?
Thanks, Ben. For those of you for Victoria, we probably best talk about 3 independent regulators. So Department of Health, who regulates water quality from a drinking water point of view. the Environmental Protection Authority, who regulates water quality from the environment or perceiving environment, and then the ESE, who regulate our prices. They will have slightly different tricks around that. I guess I'm taking them from the back. Pricing regulation, part of the role of a water corporation is to set price to customers to do the services that they want. And as I spoke before, things like statements of obligations or Victorian government policy are considered by the ESC when they work out the price that a water corporation should set for the next 5 years. So I guess some of the opportunities is ensuring and demonstrating as a water corporation that they are meeting the obligations of those policies and strategies in the most cost-effective way for customers. So it is always a trade-off and an evidence base. So that's probably my highlight bent, which is my experience with those three regulators is evidence, proof, and community willingness. And the same thing in that pricing regulatory model, the ESC also takes on the view of customers and communities, and water corporations do a lot of work in engaging their customers, often through smaller targeted groups, to get a perspective of what a community is willing to pay. So we do know through the community consultation that they do in setting prices that often there is a willingness to pay a little bit more to do innovation or manage environmental, and one of the other themes is really to re-engage with traditional owners. So, but we know from a regulatory point of view, their job is to have the most efficient and effective price and ensure customers can afford to pay for it. So it's the evidence that they're doing it the best way, they're contemplating innovation, and they're doing what their customers want. In the environmental space, and I might not talk about drinking water because that's a whole other story. I guess for the Environmental Protection Authority, they introduced something known as the general environmental duty. So anyone who has an activity that could impact on the environment has an obligation to do it well. And I guess it's, again, the experiences we've had is the evidence that water corporations are acting and behaving in a way to the best of their capabilities of the environment. I would say for Victoria, that's probably one of our most challenging areas. Rob's spoken about those extreme events, and so we know some of our infrastructure and systems are not built to withstand some of the major flood or high peak events we're having. So we are seeing environmental discharges to the environment. So we are, as a sector, really trying to engage in an economic regulator who says being really efficient, an environmental regulator that says we need to do the best we can for environment. We know we're operating in an environment where we're experiencing outcomes or events that we haven't seen before. So it's a bit of learn by doing, a lot of evidence-based, and a lot of, well, if we have particular repeated incidents in the environmental space, what is it and what upgrades we're doing? It's not a perfect science for sure, Ben, and we do have real challenges in balancing, I guess, the funding required and the environmental obligations. And it's really, we've seen them emerge particularly over the last couple of years with those extreme events and the number of, I guess, discharges that may happen to the environment from assets that have never discharged the environment under previous extremes. Our question is, what else can you do? So that's where some of that innovation comes from, which is often what Rob's about to talk about.
I was going to go a little bit more grassroots, so else the debate is on grassroots. So if I take flood as an example, the regulator there for development is the Department of Transport Planning Act policies. So to work through this just really quickly about the complexity in approving development in Victoria. So we have various levels of sort of working groups that we've got going. So at the top, we've got a Housing and Building Committee of Cabinet. And then below that, we've got Interdepartmental Committee of the Secretaries of Planning, Premier and Cabinet, DECA, and then some water corporations involved. Below that, we've got executive directors at Deb's level working. So if you can picture the number of people that are involved to reform that area, it's really significant. But we're making real progress. So I mentioned some of the commitments that the Victorian government has made and planned for Victoria around flood risk reduction due to climate change, including streamlining planning scheme amendments so that we get faster science into the planning system so that people aren't caught out by getting approval to build in an area that is inherently dangerous. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes there to ensure a hooked up, lined up version of whole of government decision making And it's about how we work in that system, as well as the sort of formal structures that I've kind of mentioned there. So there's a bit of behaviour work in that to get curious about how other parts of government work.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. Sorry, thank you.
Nicola Nelson, I'm with the Australian Water Association. I think just continuing on this theme around engagement with regulators, the importance of trying to embed climate adaptation into future investment in infrastructure. I guess I was just interested in your thoughts. I mean, there's going to be an unprecedented amount of investment in water infrastructure over the next 5 to 10 years. We're seeing this play out in Sydney at the moment with a big pricing submission that's sort of under review, you know, $25 to $30 billion worth of infrastructure. Such a great opportunity to be starting to have that investment in ensuring that that infrastructure is more resilient, which has always been a really hard sell with sort of regulators, obviously, but getting customers in that conversation as well. I just wondered how you're going about that from the point of investment, but also there's this huge change around resourcing for the sector too, and having enough skills and expertise to deliver that and maintain it. So just wondered your thoughts.
Just a broad question.
I think the answer is yes. It is an incredibly big challenge. Again, for Victoria, it will be in the absolute multi-billions of capital investment for Victoria to both manage growth, and particularly growth in regional parts of Victoria where previously a lot of the large-scale investment has been a bit more centralised. That we do know some of our more regional-based water corporations will be tenfold capital investment programs over the coming decade. It is a real challenge. We're probably not quite there yet. I did sit on a panel with my ESC colleague, and they are very comfortable from a price point of view, the importance of bringing in climate adaptation and resilience into that investment program. And I guess in Victoria, we talk a little bit about it as single points of failure in the system. So we have a network that relies on some pretty big water supplies and 2 pretty big water treatment plants in Melbourne. And what we've been doing with water corporations through water supply strategies and water sewerage strategies is actually looking at where both the demand is, but also where you may have failures in the system. And so that planning, the focus on planning is really critical to when you go to the EEC for price to say, we've done the evidence, we've done the thinking. It's not just a supply and demand, but being able to manage through those known episodes of climate variability where we've got systems taken offline due to floods or taken offline due to bushfires. And we've got lived experiences of that. So for Victoria's Water Corporation and I guess investment in maintenance and growth, the next 14 out of the next 18 will do their pricing subs in 2.5 years. And so we've got some amazing lived experience of what shocks and climate change looks like in a sort of an event and episode, and they'll be building that into both the planning and evidence base that they put forward to communities. But I guess the other thing we're experiencing in Victoria is that we've been pretty lucky that we've had pretty stable water supplies for nearly a decade now. As Ron shared, Apollo Bay is in water restrictions, and that's happened very rapidly. So whatever our challenges has been, water has not been part of the critical story. So how do we re-engage with the Victorian community about the fact that water supply doesn't just happen, it actually requires investment and continuous investment. So a little bit pleased Sydney's had to kind of put it in headlights first. I think Victoria's probably got is on a trajectory rather than a step change due to sort of some of the previous investments made, but we will be in a high investment, high challenge period. To your other point around capability, absolutely, we will see high levels of people that we don't have to be able to implement. So we know a number of the water corporations are doing things like training academies, have incredible training and apprenticeship programs. So shout out to Grey West Water and Marl Water. We've got 2 really good examples where the sector's seen a need and is investing in that upskilling and training. And under the current ministerial portfolios, the Water Minister is also the Minister of Trade and for TAFEs and Skills. So we've seen her particularly interested in ensuring that the traineeship apprenticeships available actually match the demand within the water sector. So it's a known problem. Water corporations are taking it into their own hands, and it's at a minister that's really challenging us how we're going to meet that future demand.
Just one thing to add on. So in Victoria, under our emergency management arrangements, we have critical infrastructure across 11 different sectors. And one of the things I wanted to make the point of our investment in renewable energy. What does that mean during major wind events that knock out power lines? So in February of last year, we had a major wind event right across Victoria that knocked down some major transmission towers in Anarchy, just north of Geelong. That instantly led to an outage at Loy B, which is one of our major generators that led to, in the event, around 1 million Victorians would have lost power during that event that lasted about a few days. So different people lost power at times. The paid number of customers was 500,000 energy customers. The water sector barreled on through a lot of investment behind the meter generation, through their solar panels and batteries as well. So it all connects, I guess I'd say. We also learned in that event that we need vital critical infrastructure to be able to operate for 72 hours during power outage. Because other critical infrastructure, like hospitals, need to have their power restored first. So there is that framework that looks across the interdependencies, across the critical infrastructure. So it's not just water that's making a big investment for climate resilience, right across the economy.
So for those of you who don't know, Rob and I have worked together about 15 years, so this is the tag team. What Rob is not also saying is one of the other lessons from that, which I think is really relevant to this, is the power of support and mutual aid. So one of the things that came out of that event was actually the creation of what's known as a mutual aid framework. I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm going to talk about it because Rob set it up and he's not trying to do it himself crazy, so I will. Which is really a framework between the water corporations around both the shared assets, so the capacity to move generators to where it's needed, because basically the water sector, while water supply and sewerage is important, hospitals and others get the priority of the upgrades to electricity, and we can run those large systems on generators. So we do have arrangements through Vic Water, which is our peak body overseeing over the top of the 18 water corporations, get support from Rob's emergency team that allows assets to be shared. The nature of that event was that it was long-lived, so the other thing we did was personnel sharing. So we have pretty unique systems, and if you're trying to operate systems over 24 hours, people get worn out pretty quickly. So one of the benefits of having publicly owned entities is, I guess, that all-in together framework, and we do have a mutual aid framework which shares both assets and also personnel, which backs in some of those sort of instant and immediate challenges.
Let's put our hands together for Deb and Rob. Thank you so much.